Are they leaving? Are they staying? Bible reading? Ever praying? Will the church be ever graying? Don't you see why we are saying, are the kids alright?
Welcome to Are the Kids All Right, the latest subseries from the Holy Post. Whether you're a parent, a youth pastor, a teacher, or a young person yourself, you've probably seen all of the headlines concerning Gen Z. Rates of depression and loneliness are surging, their relationship with technology is kind of troubling, and they are leaving the church in droves. We've talked about these trends a lot on the Holy Post, but we're not alone. 10 by 10 is a new collaborative discipleship initiative whose mission is to make faith matter more for this younger generation. You'll hear more about the great work they're doing later in the show, but we've partnered with 10 by 10 to create this series and to hear from experts in each episode about the challenges young people and those who care about them are facing. One of those experts is Felicia Song, a professor of sociology at Westmont who studies the place of digital technologies in contemporary life. She regularly speaks on digital practices, social media, the digital media industry, parenting in the digital age, and spiritual formation at universities and colleges, churches, schools, parent groups, and conferences. Caitlin Chess sat down with Felicia to find out if the kids are going to be all right.
Felicia, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this today.
Sure, it's a real pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about technology, internet culture, and especially how we should think about this when it comes to teenagers and young people. In some sense, I feel like this might be helpful for people who have kids, but also I'm thinking about myself. I'm still pretty young and have a lot of questions about how we can form better lives with relationship to these kinds of things. So why don't we start out with you just telling us a little bit about how you got interested in studying this? I love at the beginning of your book, Restless Devices, you talk about kind of a certain level of ambivalence about technology or social media apps. So tell us a little bit about how you got interested in it. And maybe for people who are skeptical, like, why should we listen to someone who got off the apps? Why should we listen to someone who's like a little unsure about all of this stuff?
Yeah, so I got interested in mass media generally, actually, early on after college. I actually stumbled upon a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman back in the day. And I was really interested in the way that media impacts us, not in its content, like what programming or music actually we're listening to, but how the experience of media, like watching things or listening things, actually started to shape us. And so right after college, I was teaching at a boarding school, and this is really going to date me, but they got email. They got email for the first time. And at this boarding school, all the students started emailing each other. And it was really interesting because at this boarding school, it talked a lot about community. And when they got email, I was really interested in the fact that we weren't talking about how the email was affecting community, people's relationships with each other, people's ways of being with each other within that life of the school. And so that really got me interested in digital technology. And so I've been kind of chasing that ever since. And I think, like you said, I'm a kind of a late adopter. I'm just generally someone who, I walk into a room and I don't jump into the conversation. I kind of check things out for a while, scope out the situation. And so, I'm very careful, deliberative about the things I decide to invest in. But I also recognize that there's lots of amazing goodness, right, that comes out of our digital lives. And so I think what I'm interested in is trying to help people think about how it is that technologies are incredibly beneficial. A lot of us also don't have certain choices about the role of technology in our lives at work or at school or in our communities. But at the same time, there are also real costs. And I think there's so much of life that is like that, right? There are real benefits to things, but then there are real costs. And that we live in a society that is still learning to talk about those costs and learning to figure out how do we live in a way that both holds on to the good, but very much understands that there's loss, there's costs that come with trying to move forward with those goods.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting hearing you talk about email coming on the scene for some people, because I'm young enough that like I don't really remember. I mean, I don't remember a world without internet at all.
Yeah, right.
I remember a world where I didn't have my phone that is beeping at me right now, but I was really young. I think I got it in like end of high school. And now that feels so late compared to when some people are getting phones, especially not just, my first phone was like a flip phone. People are getting this amazing computer just like in their pockets, sometimes at really young ages. And you talk in your book about the phrase digital natives, like people sort of like me, but especially people even younger than me. And you talk about why that might not be a helpful way to think about younger generations, why that might not why that might not explain very much to us about what's happening with young people and technology. So can you talk a little bit about what we're missing with that framing? I think a lot of people think, okay, it's natural to young people. They know how to use it well. And maybe we even start to think that they will naturally know how to use it healthily, or that it doesn't affect them the same ways. Talk to us a little bit about why that might not be a helpful framing for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly an element of truth to it. You put a tablet in a toddler's hands and they just know how to kind of start moving through it. And my children can help me navigate our fantastic smart television through things that I'm always like very clunky with. But I think what we do lose out on assuming that our young people will flourish. I mean, I think that's sort of the idea, but behind the comparison of the digital native and the digital immigrant, right, is that the native will simply know how to flourish with this technology. And I think the problem is that it's not just when we talk about technology, we're not just talking about a device. We're not just talking about the thing that's on your wrist, right? And just like your relationship with just that device. When I think of technology as a sociologist, I think of technology as an environment. It's an entire ecology. It's an entire landscape. It's actually become a way of being, right? It's like, I don't need to be on my phone or in front of a laptop to be thinking about a social media post or thinking about the email or thinking about the mess, right? Or having that occupy my spirit, right? Or having the dynamics of those communications and informations be altering the way I shift my internal attention or priorities. That whole thing is what I think human beings, right? And it doesn't matter how much you may have grown up with it. It is not made, actually, I would argue, it is not made for the ways that we actually are as human beings who are people who live in bodies, in places, in time. Our digital environment is 24/7. It is relentless. It is a machine, I mean, literally, right? Yeah. And it demands of us machine-like qualities that just doesn't fit who we are as human beings. And so that's where it is, I think, super important for us to start to tease out, especially with our young people, what are those spaces, right, that we need to explore and make sure we address.
Yeah, that's such a helpful way of describing it. I spend a lot of time on social media. I'm a writer. It kind of felt when I started like that was necessary. You have to kind of make a space for yourself. And it is so interesting. I'm in like book promotion season right now, which also it feels similarly where it's like, there is a particular goal I go into this with. I wrote something that I think is good. I want people to read it, hopefully for the glory of God. But once you're in that environment, it has its own goals, and like you adopt them without realizing it, and it shapes you. And one of the things I thought was so interesting that you said in your book was that instead of just thinking about time limits on media consumption or engagement on social media, there might be other questions for us to think about. And I'd be curious to hear you talk about that, because I'll even find in myself, even if there's a limit, and I have limits set on my phone to like kick me off Instagram, there's other things going on in terms of what am I doing with this? Like, how do I not have the values of this shape me? Or how do I pay attention to what I'm wanting to get out of this? So help us figure out it. I think the limits thing is a good thing to think about. People, I mean, I've done the thing where I've looked at my, my iPhone will tell me how much time I've spent on it, and it's horrifying. But I also think even when I spend less time, that's not in and of itself telling me if I'm approaching this thing well or not.
Yeah. Well, I think the time limit measure is such an interesting one. It's a powerful one, like you said, and it's one that we can very much control, whether it's for ourselves or if you're a parent and you're trying to be a responsible parent and trying to set guidelines for your children. But I think the larger question is, what do we think that time limit is actually representing, right? Exactly as you said. So if I'm going to make sure that I am not on my devices by 9:00 at night, let's say, like I turn everything off, right? Then there's a question of, well, what's that for? Right? Like, what am I doing after 9:00, right? What's the larger vision of life that I'm interested in pursuing, right? And so there's then it opens up all these different questions about, well, what do I want to be paying attention to, right? Is it that I want to save that time for people, right? Like I want to spend the time with the people that are proximate to me in my household, right? Is that what it is? Or is it that I want to prioritize time with myself, right? Maybe I've just kind of been externalizing all day, right? Like posting and emailing and so forth. Like I need to kind of do something, like I need to ground myself with exercise or journaling or playing music, right? Something that grounds me. Or is it that I just need to rest or I need to pray, right? So it's all about what is the priority or what is the aspects of our life that are easily forgotten or kind of sifted out of our lives when we are constantly at the beck and call of our devices and the various demands that they place on us, right? And I often, so I teach college, and so I often ask my students this question. I say, well, when you look at, like, imagine that you have lived a full life, right? And you're older and you look back, what do you want to see, right? What do you want to see when you turn your shoulder and you look back on your life, right? And no surprise, nobody says, right? Like I had this many followers or I had this successful, TikTok, or like, it's not that. It's, I want to have traveled. I want to have spent time with my family and my friends, right? It's all about that. So I say, okay, that's fine, right? Well, if you want that, how are you living? You got to start getting on that train now, right? And it's not to say we can't cultivate good friendships through social media and being online, right? That can all serve that purpose, right? But most of the time people say, I think of time spent around the dinner table together, right? And then it's like, okay, well, how are you going to do, let's start doing that, right? And so I think that's the larger question, is always like, what do you imagine is the full life?
Yeah.
And how do we start to make these small adjustments to make sure we don't keep forgetting about it, right? That's not later, it's now.
Yeah. I'm curious how you would encourage people, I mean, especially people who might be thinking about young people in their lives, to get there, because I'm hearing you talk about, especially, I love the way you just said this of, why do I turn my phone off at 9:00? Like, what's there? And for me, it's, I love reading. I'm a big reader. I'm in school. I have a lot that I want to read in my field to kind of feel like I have my head above water. And I love the idea of a life that is full of books and full of conversations with people about books. But I got to tell you, like, I live alone. It's 9 p.m. and it is amazing how much all of my great ideas about a lovely evening with a book and tea just like go out the window. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, and it's truly incredible how right now I'm sitting here going, gosh, tonight, let's do that. Like, I don't want to be on my phone but it's amazing how you get in that moment and the pull of those things is so strong. So how would you suggest either people for themselves, people like me, people like your students in college, or parents trying to think about teenagers, what kind of practices or habits could we be in to help us actually like fulfill that vision we have instead of, I mean, because it happens like all sorts of addictions, right? You wake up the next day and you're like, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that, but I did. In the moment, it felt like the appealing thing to do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in part it starts actually with how we think about habits and practices. I'm actually someone who's a proponent of what I talk about in the book, experiments. And that comes out of personal weakness, actually. It's because I can't keep a New Year's resolution. I'm so bad at like making a commitment and sticking to it.
Oh, that's so reassuring.
I'm terrible at like fitness training, all that kind of stuff I'm just terrible. And I'm also someone that tends to just fear failure, right? Like I fear saying I'm going to do something and then just falling on my face. So for me, what actually works is experiments, because there's no failing experiments. Experiments are always about collecting data. Whatever happens, you learn something, even if what happens isn't what you may have hoped or what you anticipated, you still learn something, and that becomes a part of your process, actually. And so with experiments, I always recommend small incremental experiments, not like, I'm going to start turning off all my devices at 9 o'clock and read for 3 hours, right? Like that's way too ambitious, right? In my book, I would say like, let's just start maybe once a week, right? Trying something for a short period of time and seeing how that goes, right? It's to me, it's practices and habits are training in muscle memory. And it's just in that sense, like athletes or musicians, right? They start with the basics and they just do it over and over and over. And so one of the things I think I really encourage in my students is that when we think about curtailing some part of technology in our life, we also add to that or pair it with something that is generative, that we think is life-giving. In your case, you talked about reading, right? But for other people, it might be going out on a run, or it might be playing music, doing something that they know that they love, that they forget about in the hustle and bustle of all that's appealing on our screens. And so I think when we start small and we actually remember, oh, this tastes really good. Right? Like this was a half an hour well spent. I'm so glad, right? I think we'll go back to it, right? And this is a Augustinian view of human nature, right? That we are creatures of appetite, that we are creatures that have been created with appetites for God, and that's built into that's beauty, that's goodness, right? And so when we taste that, we're going to want more of it. And I think especially for young people, I think, you see that, you always hear stories of kids who have to go to those summer camps where you have to not use your phones, right? And everyone like pitches a fit in the beginning. But then after the week's done, everyone's like totally thrilled and happy and excited. And everyone even says to each other, wasn't that great? Like we can have a conversation and, we weren't looking at our phones, or someone wasn't, and then it's really sad because on the drive home, everyone's back on their phones. Right? But it's like, and that's a reality we have to figure out. But there's something really beautiful. My point is, there's something really beautiful about letting young people experience, like creating those spaces to experience something so delicious, so wonderful, like it expands their imaginations about like, whoa, this is what being friends can be like. Forming new friendships can look like this, right? Or I forgot I could use my body this way and jump into a water hole, right? Like this is so exhilarating. And so I think for parents, educators, people who work with kids, one of the things I often try to encourage is not so much focusing on the, like curtailing, got to throw away the phone, right? Yeah. Like there's realities to that, but there's also limits, I think. But I think the the carrot, shall we say. The carrot is going to be, how do we create spaces and experiences for young people that remind them, I love art, like I love working with clay, or I love getting messy, right? Or I love cooking and tasting something that is off screen, right? So that then there becomes a chance to build in more balance, right? And say, hey, you really light up when you do this activity. And this draws on you in a way that you never seem to tap into when you're on your screen. Hey, how do we cultivate that more,
That's such a good word for just like so many aspects of like Christian theology, to say like, do we have a positive vision instead of just restriction or absence? I feel like there's a part of this that there might not be an easy answer to, but I'm curious what you think, because there's the social dimension of this in terms of, a lot of young people feel like if I'm on my phone less, I don't have relationships I would have had otherwise. And then there's the even larger structural part of this, which I heard you recently virtually at Duke speak about this, and they paired you with a computer science professor to talk about technology. And I think they thought there might be some conflict, like you would be kind of anti-technology and this professor would be kind of pro-technology. And I thought it was so interesting that the end of the conversation was really the both of you just being like, these companies have incredible control over our lives, and the technology, I mean, in some sense, like, stop beating yourself up so much, because it really is addictive, and the algorithms work in ways that pull you in. And so is there any word for us when it feels like the structural elements of this feel overwhelming, either for parents going, I can't, consign my high schooler to a total lack of social life, or someone who's like me, in college or after college going, I would like to get out of this. It feels impossible. Are there things we can do to maybe not completely overcome some of this structural stuff, but are there small ways we could kind of push back against it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I despair about this every other day because I think it is very powerful. And I think we are naive if we don't acknowledge how powerful it is. And especially the degree to which these industries have little or no interest in our well-being at all. And I think, to me, that's what's particularly concerning for young people coming up now. And, we're starting the conversation. The Surgeon General is kind of getting on board, right? Talking about like the real ramifications that are possible for so many young people in this, in a deleterious way, right? Like harming their mental health, harming their self-esteem. And so I think there is something very serious we need to engage with in terms of the negative aspects or the overwhelming pressures of these industries. But in terms of what space we can carve out in light of that, I think, to me, it's, as you said, it's not just about technology, but in so many other areas of our life. It is about, in some parts of the church, there's language about how to live a well-ordered life, right? That there can be, like, the industries encourage us towards a disordered life, right? Constantly being online, constantly posting, constantly feeling pressure to, right, engage. So that's a kind of disordered life. Other ways I think about it is I think about how it's about freedom, right? Like, it's not to say that I can't have this technology in my life, but how do I have it in my life in such a way that there is actually a freedom in my relationship with this device or with this platform? I am not beholden to it. It does not master me, right? It does not shape the way that I live, right? But it functions for me, right? It helps me stay in touch with my friends in this very clear way. But I'm also, when I'm aware of the way that it's creeping in to the way I think about myself or the way that I'm using my time, right? Then I need to be very aware about, like, okay, how do I put the barriers or limit myself, right, in ways that give me the freedom I know I need from this. And that's where I think the conversations about parenting and young people gets complicated for me, because I think we are all very different as people. And, parents always talk about, even, if they have more than one child, they can see their children can be so different, right? Some are just going to be more inclined towards something or another. Some will be more prone to have kind of addictive propensities than other of their children. And so I think what makes it hard to set kind of like hard and fast guidelines, like everyone should do this, everyone should do that by this age or that age, is super complicated by who we are as people, what life circumstances we happen to be living in, where technology plays a certain role, right? A function that can be super productive and necessary even, right? And so I think it's needing to look at all the factors, right, in our individual lives, in our household lives, in our communal lives, to figure out, okay, where do I let the technology weave in to my day-to-day in a way that is actually serving me and I'm not serving it.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, especially right now, about, there's been a lot published recently about especially teenage girls' relationship to social media. And I was just talking with a friend recently about like our kind of weird relationship with Instagram. And we were feeling like we are adults, like our brains are fully developed, and like we've been through high school and college, and like we've experienced some of like the insecurity and puberty and all of that. And we're out of that. And it still feels like it is overwhelming. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, I think especially because that feels so prevalent right now, how could parents or youth leaders or people who, I hope a lot of young people, especially teenagers, have a variety of adults in their lives, how could they encourage them to not just say, okay, here's the list of rules, or like here's the hard and fast, but how do you think they could help teenagers themselves, especially they're becoming adults, they're going to have to do this for themselves, identify when it's unhealthy, when this has the kind of power over you that you were just describing? Are there things that like internally we could notice and see like, okay, this is too much, or questions we could ask ourselves? I really appreciate how you just described it will be different for everyone, and I've seen that with teenagers in my life and with my friends. But I think we all have all experienced that place of, oh, it's gotten bad. Like, this is not the kind of relationship I want to have. Are there things that could help us discern that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the good news is I feel like in the last 5 years, people are beginning to discern that and talk about it more, right? That it's becoming more acceptable. I see that in my students. My students are much more open about the negative effects that they see in their own lives. I think very often it's difficult. I always joke about my book that when I talk to parents that it's very much intentionally not a parenting book, because I have teenagers myself, and I'm still wandering around not knowing what I'm doing. And so I don't have any of this figured out at all. I am in the trenches up to my eyeballs as well. And so I think of it in terms, I guess I think in two ways. I think technology is just a part of our young people's lives, just like lots of other aspects of their lives are. And I want to be able to try to cultivate an open channel of conversation about it in their lives, in our relationship, so that we can talk about it in a way that doesn't seem like a power struggle. And that's very challenging for our parents, obviously, because there is that relationship. But how do we talk about it in a way that my approach, this is drawing on the wisdom of those who have gone before me with older children now. They've counseled that one big part is like, I need to be vulnerable. I need to say, I have trouble with the tech, just as you said about the Instagram, right? It's like, I can't keep myself from not being formed by it. So how can you think that you're not going to be, right? Like, we're all like, no, none of us is immune, right? There's not an issue of like, oh, I'm this grown woman and I figured it out. You have to too, right? It's like, no, we're all in this and we're all just a bunch of guinea pigs. Nobody knows how this is going to turn out, right? Like, because no one's done this before, like ever, right? And so part of it is being vulnerable and saying, hey, let's moving towards a capacity to journey with, right? Instead of, oh, I know how this works, kind of like in the way that like, I know how to drive a car, I'll teach you, right? It's different from that conversation. And then the other part really is about, again, encouraging young people to experience something else, right? And so that even when they're with their friends, like, what can we do, right, that's not as screen oriented? Or what can we do that reminds them of how to have fun and be together that isn't so platform based, right? And so I think there are times for the kind of direct conversations, right? And the vulnerability that I think is hard to get to in any area of our lives, both as parents and as children, right? Those are just hard things to talk about, right? It's hard to talk about loneliness. It's hard to talk about feeling left out from this particular friendship, right? Dynamic. Those are just hard things. And so I'm just as bad as the next parent in terms of feeling little courage about those kinds of conversations. But I think it's in that sense just the same as any other part of parenting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good word. One last question, Felicia. When you spend a lot of time with young people, you have teenagers, but also you have students. When you think about younger generations today, what makes you hopeful?
I think that young people actually today, especially when they've grown up with the technology, are much, even though they may be formed in these fundamental ways that can become problematic, right, that we need to really keep an eye on. I think there's a lack of utter amazement that people as old as me can have about technology, right? And there's a kind of faster to critique it, to be like, like this is something's off here. And so I see that in my students. They're faster than a lot of my own peers to be critical of it once they see it, right? It's sort of like, oh yeah, that's dumb. And I think I'm interested in, I feel like as a society, we're kind of hitting this interesting inflection point, right? Where we're talking about things more and we're starting to say, hey, wait a second, this doesn't seem so great. What can we be doing to build something that's different? This back to a point you made earlier about the conversation with the computer scientist, right? It's like the technologies we have today don't have to be the way that they are, right? Like Instagram, like being able to connect with friends doesn't have to look like Instagram or TikTok or Be Real. Like the technology itself doesn't dictate it. That is an industry that is based on an economy, right? So there are other alternatives that we can explore, right, that address the realities of not being in the same space, of being marginalized in certain circumstances, and so forth. So my hope is that we can start exploring that as we start to recognize the downsides of what we have now. And, hopefully, again, the research is going to start to catch up. Like, we need data. We need data to kind of back the necessity of building these new kinds of spaces.
Thank you so much for your wisdom and for just the compassion that I feel like you helped a lot of people breathe a sigh of relief about like, this is hard, but it's not impossible. And we are all kind of figuring it out. So thank you so much.
Yeah, great. I'm so glad it was helpful.
This episode is sponsored by 10 by 10. More than 1 million young people in the U.S. are walking away from the church every year, but it doesn't have to be this way. 10 by 10 is a diverse group of Christ followers from different cultures, ethnicities, and traditions. 100 organizations working together to address this concerning trend. 10 by 10 has 4 priorities: to make youth discipleship a top focus for U.S. ministry leaders, to elevate leaders of color and their organizations and networks to reflect the diversity of the body of Christ in the world today, to curate, create, and share resources and training to equip local leaders to reach the next generation, and to connect and mobilize partner organizations to collectively impact 100,000 diverse faith communities nationwide. Learn more about 10 by 10 by going to the website 10by10.org. That's TENX10.org. TENX10.org to empower you to help faith matter more to the next generation. And thanks to 10 by 10 for sponsoring this episode.
Okay, Sky, we are talking about the interview that I did with Felicia Wu-Song, who's someone I have been reading and learning from for a long time. And she actually came and did an event here at Duke and talked about our relationship to technology with a bunch of college students. So I've heard her do that before, but it was great to get to ask her some deeper questions about this. I have some things that she said that I'm curious what you think about. But first, you listened to the interview. Mm-hmm. Was there anything in it that stuck out to you or that you were surprised by or that was interesting?
Yeah, 2 things probably struck me the most. And it wasn't what I was expecting, because she's written on this, she's an expert on this, she's an academic. So I was assuming going into this, it was going to be kind of a data-heavy, academically minded, intellectual engagement. And what struck me was her empathy as a mother of teenagers for just the struggle, that there aren't simple answers here. That was a big piece of this. And then the other thing that struck me, and I don't know, maybe some others who listen to this are frustrated by it, but she didn't really have cookie cutter answers.
Yeah.
And sometimes we go to those experts going, all right, you've studied this, give us the solution. And she didn't give us easy solutions. She gave us insightful wisdom, but not, here's what I would recommend, steps 1, 2, and 3. It wasn't that simple. So empathy and no simple solutions, which that's both satisfying and unsatisfying.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about that I wanted to ask you about was, and one of the things I've heard her talk about that I think is really interesting, is the acknowledgement she has of the structural issues at play here. I feel like so much of this conversation about technology for everyone, but especially technology with young people, is framed as if it's about personal habits and decision making, and just put a limit on your phone or kind of come up with some new habits. And there isn't always an acknowledgement of not only the structural factors of the way your community is structured impacts the choices you make, but really like the overwhelming power technology companies have in our lives. And then the like chemical, biological part of it. Like, I've been comforted listening to her go, there's something happening in your brain. Like, it is not just a question of willpower. There are really powerful tools these companies are using that they know function in an addictive kind of way. And she is not a policymaker, so she's not necessarily going to kind of say, like, here's the framework for how we fix this. But I was curious if you had any response to that or thoughts about that, because I do think it's one of the really challenging questions for both parents and pastors and people in young people's lives to go, I'm coming up against something that isn't just personal habit. This is a much larger thing. But then for all of us, if we're trying to advocate for students, what are things we can do? I mean, not just like, how do we change a national policy? That might be too complicated, but are there structural things that we could do that could push back against that a little bit?
Yes. It reminded me, it came up in my interview with Jean Twangy, that this is fundamentally a collective action problem.
Yeah.
Where you as an individual young person or you as a household might make decisions around technology, but it's really, really hard to do that when no one else in your community is making that same decision, and suddenly your kids or your household is the only oddball
Yeah.
it's incredibly challenging. So there is a collective action problem. And I read an article this week, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a town in Ireland that voted it was a voluntary kind of thing, but they voted that all the parents in this town said, none of us are going to give phones to our kids before the 7th grade or something like that.
Wow.
And they interviewed a bunch of the parents afterwards and like, this makes me feel so much better because I know our family, my kid won't be the only one not doing this. Like they recognize it as a collective action problem. And in my own community, I have one kid left at home in high school. She's a sophomore in high school. The high school has a new principal this year who's actually was an administrator for many years at the school and a friend of ours. And the new principal has put a policy in place where the kids are not allowed to have their phones in classrooms anymore. So when they come into the classroom, they have to put their phones in some kind of, I don't know, holder thing they have, and then they can get the phone back when they leave. And this created a bit of an uproar at the beginning of the school year.
Yeah.
I've talked to my daughter about it, and she said, no, like, I love it, and all my friends love it. That's a collective action thing where the administration came in and said, we're making this decision because it's best for the learning environment, it's best for the kids. So I think that all of those examples show this is best tackled beyond just individual habit or even individual household decisions. That has to be there too, but we do need doctors and educators and government officials and, yes, technology companies making decisions that are for the common good, not just for the bottom line. And that's incredibly challenging in America, especially where we don't have a collectivist ethos. We have a hyper individualistic one. So this technology problem seems to be uniquely designed to destroy American society because we, of all people, lack the tools to deal with it. But there's progress being made in certain ways, which is hopeful.
Yeah. Yeah. A related part of this that I just so appreciated about her was not just kind of recognizing the structural issues, but also wanting to say, what is the positive vision of a good human life that we're oriented towards? Because I don't have kids, but I'm around a lot of people who have teenagers, and I spend a lot of time with the teenagers in my church. And it does feel like the easiest response is just to be like, here's a list of no's, like the rules of the things you can't do. And I loved how she described, like, are we really talking about how this is a no to something, but it's a yes to something else that actually is really good and positive? And I kept thinking about, I've seen a lot of people talk about how, students that are brand new in college these days are really struggling in part because of the pandemic and the fact that there were a lot of social skills that just weren't learned at the age that they would previously have been learned in. But that part of it is, if you don't have a vision, in part because of the pandemic and the restrictions we had to make with the knowledge we had, if you don't have a vision for what a good life lived in embodied community looks like, then of course the goodness that you have found online feels like the good thing that's available. You don't have this like picture of this other thing. I'm curious, you don't have to talk about this with your own kids, but like if you think about how pastors or parents could tell that story, because I could imagine a way that you have a good intention to do this and it is a lecture. It's like, let me tell you, here's a bunch of facts about human life, which is not, I think, what she's getting at. But what could that look like practically to actually expose kids to that?
One thing she did say that it was absolutely true. Dr. Wusong talked about in her own parenting, and she got this advice from others, I think she said, is admit your own struggle with the technology. So I think part of it is not telling kids, here's a positive vision of what life can be. It's modeling for kids. First, I'm struggling with this too. We're all, one of her quotes that I wrote down from the interview is, we are all a bunch of guinea pigs.
Yeah.
That it's not just you young guys that are struggling with this. We are too. This is new for us too. We're all guinea pigs. We're all struggling with it. We're not judging you for struggling with this because we are too. And then model for them, there are these other things in life that are really, really good that to fully experience the goodness of, we need to put boundaries on this technology. And we want to create environments where we together, adults and teenagers, are experiencing these good things. I still think it's a real uphill battle though. The analogy that comes to mind is junk food. We've all had unbelievably delicious, healthy, gourmet, organic, wonderful food, right? We've all had that, and we know it's so good. And yet, a biggie French fry from Wendy's is like, sometimes you just want, right? It's the convenience of fast food
Yeah.
that makes it so appealing. It's not that it's inherently better tasting than really good food. And same thing with the technology. It's just so convenient, and it gives you that dopamine hit, and it does
Yep.
satisfy short term. And there's a reason why we have an epidemic of obesity and diabetes and heart disease and cancers in this country that are all diet related. It's not because we don't know and enjoy really good cuisine. It's because the
Yeah.
convenience of fast food is there. And that's the same problem. And so I think as much as possible, we need to create environments where the technology is put aside and we're modeling for these kids. She mentioned going off to camp and not having your phone. Well, why not make church gatherings as relationally incarnate as possible?
Yeah.
Why not create family meals or gatherings with friends that are incarnate technology-free zones so people can fully experience that? I remember there was a year or two ago, I was trying to get a hold of my son one day, and I could track his phone. I knew he was at a friend's house, and he wasn't answering. He just wasn't answering his phone. It was driving me crazy. And like an hour or two goes by, and finally he responded. I'm like, what's been going on? And he's like, oh, we all threw our phones into the house and we were all playing basketball outside. And I'm like, oh, yes, that's a good thing.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah,
good reason
yeah.
not to have your phone out there. So like, and to validate though, when kids make those good decisions to go, oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, that was fantastic. But I think we need to model it. And that's hard. I've joked about this on other podcasts, maybe you were on, where when I was a kid growing up, the big push was get your family to turn off the television and have a meal at a table together. And now I consider it a victory when my family is all watching the same television together. Like we're not on separate devices watching something, we're all facing the same screen. But even that is like a win where we're having a shared experience rather than atomized experiences where we're in our own screens. So yeah, I don't, other than modeling
Yeah.
it, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah. Well, and even what you were just saying makes me think of I don't remember if she said this in the interview or if I've just heard her say this or talk about this before, but that there's a difference between certain kinds of engaging with technology. Like it's not just the amount of time that you spend. There's a real difference between just consuming something from a TV or from a individual device versus using it towards some creative purpose. Like there's a different part of your brain that's involved, and it is more communal. And I had a friend in my small group at church who said that he grew up in a house where no one watches TV alone. Like no one consumes things alone. It's either a communal thing or we're doing something creative. Like I'm creating something with this technology. And that was helpful too, to imagine what would it look like for the conversation again to not just be no limits and ways in which this thing that you're enjoying is just bad for you. But is there a different way to go about this where there is technology that really helps us be creative, that helps us build community? It's just that not all of it does. Like if we were saying no to all technology in our churches, there's a lot of other stuff we would be getting rid of besides our cell phones. But we've determined that some of that is actually oriented towards community and towards creativity. And even when she was talking about it, I was thinking, like, as you said about modeling, it's not just, oh, let's get the youth group to get rid of their phones. It's like, we have adult Sunday schools where half the people are on their phones. Like, why don't we just say, like, actually, it's really important that we don't have our isolated experiences this way. Let's contribute to our community working well together. Yeah. But it's amazing the pushback I can imagine you would get from grown adults about like, please put your phone away. And I'm curious for you too, like reading her book and talking to her made me evaluate a lot of my own practices too, of going, I don't have kids, but I am involved in the lives of teenagers in my church. And if I do want to model a better life for them, that's going to take some intentionality on my end to evaluate my habits. And some of my habits are like pretty atrocious. I'm just curious how you feel about your ability to like do this well, or to have, are there things that you have found to be helpful to kind of engage with this differently? And yes, I mean, she's not against limits, like putting some just like actual limits on your use.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle with it as much as anybody. I don't feel like I'm delivered from this temptation of just doom scrolling or whatever. I honestly found it easier to be disciplined about it when my children were younger. And as they've gotten older and they're more adult, either adult or adult-like or adult-ish, it's easier for all of us to just fall into the the atomization of the devices. I I have been proud of my kids when some of them on their own accord have deleted apps because they just recognize they needed enough more of a boundary than, and it wasn't us telling them to do it. They came to the
Yeah.
conclusion of doing it, which was really gratifying. Um, but then there's also, going back to your point of how do we use some of this technology for relational good and discerning that. Like during the height of the pandemic, my son was in high school. They were not meeting in person, and we gave him more of a leash to be on video games during that time because he would get on with his friends,
Yeah.
all separated in their homes, and they would socialize through playing these games together. And normally I would have put more limits on it, but in that bizarre reality of the pandemic where he couldn't be physically present with his friends, this is as close as they could get. And so we utilized that technology to build connection, as flawed as it was, to the best of our ability. And for me, just the way I'm wired, like the best use of technology I can have is to learn. Like when I am reading what's going on in the
Yeah.
world, or I'm engaging articles or something like I feel like, yeah, my kid might look at me and see me on my phone, but I'm actually, reading this new column by David French, or I'm exploring this new research by Ryan Burge, or whatever it is I'm exploring. I'm actually learning and growing. It's a good use of this technology. I'm not just, flipping through TikToks and having my mind numbed. So I've been trying to be more aware of when am I utilizing this technology for growth, and when am
Yeah.
I utilizing it for to numb myself. And that's where I go, all right, I need to seriously limit that capacity.
Yeah. I liked the way that she talked about the experiments that she does with her students as experiments. Because like you just said, the goal being that someone, a young person or not, discovers that something isn't good and kind of implements that themselves rather than being instructed to do it. And she, in her book, Restless Devices, she gives a bunch of examples of this. I had great plans when I read the book of like, oh, I should do some of these experiments. I have not done them. I want to, partially because I do think there's not just this element of, oh, let's try something out and see if life with this technological change is actually as bad as it seems like it would be, but also that it might actually reveal deeper things going on. Like she talks in the book about, we have this desire to escape just the human condition. Like underneath this is not just, I want to be entertained, or I'm bored, or there are other needs that are being met or feelings that are being expressed in this. And if you do some of these experiments, you might discover that there's something deeper going on. I'm curious if you think when it comes to the church, there are things deeper going on, not just for individuals, that are kind of the reason why we struggle so much to do this. Because I think, again, I don't remember if she said this in the interview or if she says this in the book, but it's like we should be the place that has a very different approach to this. Why have we failed to have a really drastically different approach to the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. There's definitely deeper things going on with the church in this thing. I recently talked to Russell Moore about his new book, and early on he quoted some source about how American Christianity, I think American evangelicalism, is the most market-driven form of Christianity probably ever. And there's a good side of that and a bad side. The good side is being market-driven means the church is very receptive to the needs of people. The downside is it can be very receptive to the desires of people. And so as Americans are becoming much more technology dependent and addicted, the church sometimes will look at that, and rather than seeing it as a need to create an oasis where people can live incarnately and commune with each other deeply and with God, sometimes the church can go, oh, this is what the population wants. Well, we're going to give it more to them. We're going to make it easier for them to be on devices and streaming and social media, blah, blah, blah. And they don't think about whether this is good or bad. It's just responding to market forces. So I think that's a lot of what's driving it in the church. But I loved when she brought up that language of experimentation, because it takes success and failure out, as she put it, and just gives you data, right? On how did this go? And what it made me think about was that's really the language we ought to be using in the church around spiritual disciplines in general.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes when you say, well, we're going to do this spiritual discipline, I mean, immediately you go, oh, that sucks because it's a discipline. And then you immediately feel terrible when you're not disciplined about it, right? And instead of viewing it as a discipline is something you engage that helps you commune more deeply with God or develop an ability you didn't naturally have.
Yeah.
And some, based on our personalities and our lifestyle and all kinds of things, different disciplines are going to be more or less effective for different people. So when you say instead, we're going to experiment with this practice, this spiritual practice, and then let's say you do that a week, a month, whatever, and then you come back and go, here's what really worked for me and what didn't and why. It takes the judgment out of it. And then you might stick with it, you might adapt it, you might do something different. I think that's just a much more helpful framing around all, whether it's prayer or Bible study or fasting or putting limits on your phone. Like all of that should be framed as experimentation. What leads me into a better existence in life? What doesn't work for me and why? And hopefully in community discussing that and validating people's experiences.
Yeah, I've been reading this book by Adam Grant about how you can be a person that changes your mind more often, or how you can encourage your community to be able to more easily change their minds. And that's one of the things he says is to think like a scientist. Like we have a hypothesis, we test it, we get new information. That helps orient us towards the world in a way where we're not holding so tightly to things that maybe we don't need to just believe forever without being willing to change our minds. If we hold it a little looser by having that kind of mindset, it can be really helpful. Yeah. So thank you, Skye, for this. I'm glad we got to talk about, I loved so much of what she had to say, but especially kind of bringing it to some more practical questions for people in the church, I think is really helpful. So
no, it was an excellent interview. Thank you for doing it.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.